Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay. You're listening to new Discourses Bullets, where we give a short bullet point-like summary of a single topic from woke that we all need to understand so we can stop it. And in woke, everything is narratives all the way down. So this is the message that I want to share with you today. I want to give you an idea of woke epistemology. Now, epistemology is a fancy word that basically means ways of knowing. You're all very familiar with woke and its other ways of knowing. So what does that mean? And what does that have to do with narratives? Well, the point of this episode is to explain. So we'll start with the relevance of narratives. So in woke thinking, nothing is actually legitimately true. It is a constructivist epistemology, which means that they believe that truth is not real. It's not something out in the world discovered. It's something constructed by people. Okay? So if people think something is true, that's because other people who are authoritative told them it's the correct way to believe about what there is. And the people who get to do that the most authoritatively are the people in power. So power shapes the construction of truth, and thus people learn to perceive their world incorrectly through the lens provided for them by power, so they misunderstand the world. That is part of what Antonio Gramsci would have regarded as the cultural hegemony. I know this is a lot of vocabulary. The hardest part about communicating woke to people is that there is frankly specialized vocabulary, and you actually have to know it to talk about it in a succinct way. So hegemony is basically like the cultural milieu or force field that makes everybody think and believe in a certain way. Now, because the woke think that truth is constructed by power, and it creates this hegemony where basically everybody believes that. This is what some of the postmodernists called a truth regime. Not whether something is true or not. Something is true within a regime of truth that is created like a political object by people in power to say this is true and that is not true, and this is how everybody should believe. But because everything is narratives, it's actually narratives all the way down. So the woke view of ideas and truth is that everything is narratives. So it doesn't matter if it corresponds to reality. That's what's called the correspondence theory of truth in epistemology. It doesn't matter if it's real. It doesn't matter if it's accurate. Everything boils down to the interpretation of facts. Why we observe certain facts in the world is actually left to be an open question. It doesn't matter because the interpretation of those facts, which is to say the narratives we tell ourselves about those facts, are all that we actually have, and those are constructed by people as narratives. And so everything is this huge field of competing narratives. But some narratives win out, and they're considered knowledge or knowledges or truth. How does that happen? By dominant groups in society having more power than marginalized groups. That's actually what makes them dominant, is they have the power to set the cultural hegemony, which marginalizes both the people and the knowledges and also the ways of knowing, the epistemologies of outsider groups that are not part of the dominant narrative structure. Again, it has nothing to do, your truth, my truth, has nothing to do with whether or not anything is actually true. The belief is that everything is narratives, interpretation, and stories, and that everything as narrative, interpretation, and stories means that the people who have the most power get to set the narratives we take seriously. So the narratives that the dominant group set are going to be the ones we consider to be knowledge or knowledges or truths, and the narratives given by competitors who are marginalized are too marginalized to matter, so they're excluded from consideration as serious bids to knowledge or truth. And that this is what they actually believe is the truth about truth. But the problem is that they think because the dominant narrative is just a function of the dominant group, which is a function of the dominant group's power, which the dominant group uses only to maintain and reestablish its own power, that it's not that what we think is true is actually true. It's actually that what we think is true is a form of oppression, that the dominant group arranges its dominant narratives and everything that follows from believing what they say is true, such that the marginalized groups cannot compete with those ideas or those knowledges. So the consequence of this is that what you have is that the marginalized groups believe that what they're saying must be more true than what the dominant groups maintain, because the dominant groups are maintaining what they believe to be true, not because it's true, but because it maintains their power. I don't know if you're following me, because this is a little complicated, but that means that there is a preference in woke thinking, not just for knowledge outside of the dominant group, but specifically for knowledge that challenges the claims of the dominant group, for ways of knowing that override the so-called ways of knowing, the epistemology of the dominant group. And that's true both when there's a corruption in the dominant power section, and also when there's not one. So if we're talking about actual legitimate truths like 2 + 2 = 4, which is always true in all times and all places, for all beings, for all entities, for everything, always true, 2 + 2 = 4, the woke view is, well, there might be other values that 2 + 2 can take, and the dominant groups have a vested interest in maintaining the view that 2 + 2 = 4, not because it is so useful to believe that sometimes or that it's true, but they have a vested interest in canceling out other ways of approaching the question, because that would mean that other groups that think about the matter of 2 + 2 in a different way might in fact have a point. And so the belief is that what is regarded as true is a function of what the dominant groups believe, and its purpose is to exclude from consideration that which marginalized groups believe and how they believe it. That's extremely important. That's the description of the woke epistemology, which is that it is a preference, overwhelming preference, for not just marginalized or outsider or excluded, but specifically counter-hegemonic ideas and ways of knowing. So if it's an idea that's outside of the dominant group's view of the world, and it challenges the dominant group's view of the world, because there is no truth here, there's only narratives all the way down, and the narratives are competing, and the dominant group has power, so its narratives get to cheat because they have power to force people to believe them. So the narratives outside can't compete. But the idea is that if we create a newly biased playing field that favors outsider knowledge, other ways of knowing, indigenous knowledges, feminist knowledges, critical race interpretations or racial consciousness, feminist consciousness, class consciousness, critical consciousness, it's all the same thing. In other words, being woke. If we say that because it's actually challenging the power dynamic, the power hierarchy, has a grain of truth in it that's more true than other ideas, then we approach understanding woke epistemology. It is a deliberate preference for outsider knowledges that challenge the existing knowledge structure. So I have this book I call the Book of Woke. I'm going to read just a little bit of the 11 points that the author Joe Kinchelow gives on page 2 through 4, where he outlines what the whole point of critical constructivism is. Quickly, I'll tell you that critical constructivism was created in education theory by a critical pedagogist named Joe Kinchelow, who wrote this book, and it was created as an epistemological framework that extends into an entire worldview, which is to say, literally a religion. But here are just a few of the points. The world is socially constructed. What we know about the world always involves a knower and that which is to be known. How the knower constructs the known constitutes what we think of as reality. So that's what I just tried to tell you. Okay? All knowers are historical and social subjects. We all come from a somewhere which is located in a particular historical time frame. These spatial and temporal settings always shape the nature of our constructions of the world. And we can go on. There's a lot more of this idea. We operate and construct the world and our lives in a particular social, cultural, and historical playing field. That's what I'm saying about dominant groups. I'm trying to find one quickly where he says something about power. A key aspect of education in this context involves understanding the nature of these constructions in the realm of knowledge, the epistemological domain, he says. It is simple-minded and misleading to merely study random outcomes of the construction process, isolated facts, and, quote, truths. Constructivists are much more concerned with the processes through which certain information becomes validated knowledge, as with committing lots of it to memory. They are also concerned with the processes through which certain information was not deemed to be worthy or validated knowledges. So here he's talking about the processes by which we consider some information, some narratives to be knowledge, and other narratives not to be. And guess what? It's going to be power. That is the political power that is the determiner. It is not whether or not something is true. Critical constructivists, skipping down a few points, are concerned with the exaggerated role power plays in these constructions and validation processes. Critical constructivists are particularly interested in the ways these processes help privilege some people and marginalize others. Okay, so like I said, it's exactly the way I described it. That's how woke thinks. That there are powerful groups that arrange what we will consider to be knowledge and what we will marginalize as not being actually valid knowledge. It has nothing to do with truth. It has everything to do with whether or not the powerful group can maintain its power or it can be challenged from outsider perspectives. And then the last point that he has is, in their search for ways to produce democratic and evocative knowledges, critical constructivists become detectives of new ways of seeing and constructing the world. That is to say, in other words, counter-hegemonic ways that challenge the existing power structure, to treat that stuff as knowledge. Okay, he goes on. In this context, they come to value knowledges and forms of meaning-making traditionally dismissed by dominant culture and mainstream academics. In this subjugated context, they use the African American blues idiom to construct, quote, blue knowledge, which is the knowledge of lived experience that's marginalized to the outside by the dominant power group that doesn't want to hear it. So now you have it directly from the book of Woke, understanding this is the book that defines what woke really means, and there it is. At the bottom of Woke, several of these points deal specifically with the epistemology, the theory of knowledge and knowing, and the basic principle is that everything's narratives, all the narratives are in competition, but dominant groups have more power than marginalized groups, which is unfair and unjust, so they privilege their own ideas, call them knowledge, and marginalize the ideas and epistemologies of people that they don't want to have power, to keep them out of power. So this is the woke epistemology. It is favoring outside ideas that challenge the dominant view, and doing so specifically because you believe that everything at the end of the day is just narratives that are competing, and that the dominant view is regarded as true and knowledgeable because of the attempt to keep itself in power. That's the woke conspiracy theory. So when you see people claiming, as in the famous feminist glaciology paper that led me and Peter Boghossian to do the grievance studies affair, when you see people argue that, for the science of glaciology to overcome its anti-female biases, it has to incorporate outside ways of knowing like indigenous myth and feminist art and theory, you're seeing the exact same thing, a counter-hegemonic attack on the science, of this case, of glaciology, which studies ice, glaciers. And the idea is that you are favoring outside knowledge like indigenous myths, feminist theory, and feminist art that attack the dominant knowledge, which is actual science, which is actually based on careful observation and rigorous methodologies to determine what's going on in the world. So when you see that, for instance, woke people say you don't have to have evidence of racism because they don't have to have evidence of racism to claim racism because they live racism every day and they experience it, that's using a counter-hegemonic belief of outsider lived experience. Of course, it could be ginned up. It's all interpretation, but in the woke world, everything is constructed interpretation. It is narratives all the way down. And so they launch their counter narratives. They literally call them in CRT counter stories in order to challenge the dominant status quo that one can say, in this case, be not racist, that there is a neutral playing field with regard to race, absent a race Marxist cultural revolution. But this is also the explanation for another very controversial point that I raise a lot about the so-called woke right, and that is in particular that Tucker Carlson's shtick is woke. What he has been doing journalistically for a long time now is woke. How? How? Is he canceling people? Is he this? Is he that? Is it just because he's got questions he's asking about Israel? No, but it is the just asking questions shtick. What he's saying is that there is a dominant knowledge structure in which we're supposed to or required to think about issues in the world stage like Israel, like certain wars and other things, like generally conservative politics. There is a dominant group that has constructed a false view of reality that it uses to maintain its own power because it won't allow you to talk about other things outside of that. It marginalizes those other views. And that by just asking questions in that space, you can challenge the dominant world view. That is, outside counter-hegemonic narratives are more likely to be true and preferred because they challenge the dominant knowledge paradigm. That is the definition of woke. Let me read it to you from Kincheloe again. In their search, think about Tucker Carlson while I read the following words. In their search for ways to produce democratic and evocative knowledges, critical constructivists become detectives. Hold on, let me stop again and point out. When he says democratic knowledges, he means that everybody gets to participate, that there's not some view that is excluded. It's democratic, not like voting, not like our democracy of the Democratic Party. It is not like politics. It is like how everybody having a smartphone democratized broadcast, or everybody being on social media democratized the ability to have a voice in the public square. What it did was it allowed everybody to participate. So in their search for ways to produce democratic and evocative knowledges, critical constructivists, that is woke people, become detectives of new ways of seeing and constructing the world. In this context, they come to value knowledges and forms of meaning-making traditionally dismissed by dominant culture and mainstream academics. I would love to know what part of that Tucker Carlson doesn't satisfy as a definition for woke epistemology. But it's not just Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is obviously just a very prominent figure who has been doing the just asking questions shtick. He's just one figure among many who are questioning now the broad post-war liberal consensus about how we all are supposed to think and that there's legitimate ideas about how society is to be organized and illegitimate ones that are marginalized by the power structure that's just working to maintain itself and isn't actually aligned with truth in any way. The whole post-war consensus narrative that virtually every conservative commentator, even ones who are explicitly not woke right, like Glenn Beck, has picked up. Everyone's talking about this idea. It is a systemic power dynamic, a alleged narrative put forth by the dominant group, which are called neocons, and maybe Jews. It is this dominant narrative put forth by a dominant group in order to exclude the right-wing voices that are to be marginalized because they occupy a completely different politic, specifically because those dominant groups are trying to maintain dominance over politics. It is a woke conspiracy theory. Tucker Carlson plays into this, but so does almost every conservative commentator because the right is rapidly going woke. I don't like it. I'm not happy about it, but the term fits. And the reason is because it's narratives all the way down. And when you have narratives all the way down and there's no actual solid truth that you can use to set your guidestones, it all becomes this power dynamic battle where the people who are already in power must be telling you lies, so the people who are speaking truth to power, aka counter-hegemonic narratives and counter stories, must be telling you something more true than the establishment can provide. Do you understand now why the woke right has adopted a woke epistemology, even when their criticisms about specific things do ring true?